Welcome to InFocus, a closer look at human relations. I'm your host, Bill Bell. This program is supported by the Cincinnati Human Relations Commission. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Gary Zola from you're from Hebrew Union College.
I teach on Hebrew Union College, but
Okay.
I direct the American Jewish Archives, which is on the campus of the Hebrew Union College.
Okay, and thank you for being here. Prior to the start of our show, we were discussing just some historical events that we all know about, but we're not sure of each other's roles in it. So I like to take that discussion and bring it to this show. And one of the things I want to talk about is this picture here, it's a this picture of Dr. King.
Right.
And this is
Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel
Okay.
with Dr. King, and that's when the two of them were marching together in Selma.
Okay.
And the picture is reflective of something I was saying to you off camera, which is that the American Jewish Archives, which, as you know already, is located on the campus of HUC, is the largest collection of documentary evidence on the history of the Jew in the world.
Okay.
And there's probably something like 30 or 40 million pieces of paper there. But mostly people, when they hear the words American Jewish Archives, they think, well, this is going to be a collection with religious material. But in fact, it's all about the history of America, but through the window of the American Jew. So the picture you were looking at is a picture of really representing the efforts that many Jews, not all, but many Jews made in terms of helping Dr. King during the civil rights period. And Rabbi Heschel was a very interesting man. He was a refugee from Germany.
Okay.
And he was fortunate enough to be able to get out of Germany because he was a young scholar.
Okay.
And actually, he was saved by the Hebrew Union College, because in order to get over here in the 1930s, you had to have a visa, you had to have special permission so that the government could make room for you to immigrate, because there were so few spaces for Jews to come to the United States. So you had to prove you could work and where you would be working. So various organizations would try to do that for people. The Hebrew Union College, of course, said, in the case of maybe about 8 or 9 scholars who were in Germany, we'll take them and they will teach here in Cincinnati. And so Dr. Heschel was one of them. He was a young man at the time.
Uh-huh.
And later, after 5-6 years, he took another position in New York at a different seminary. And because of his experiences, Rabbi Heschel was very interested in the civil rights movement. He saw a direct connection between what had happened to him and what was the current situation for the African American in this country. And so he was an activist. And that activism grew out of his own experience. And that picture is one of many we have of rabbis and Jewish leaders who tried to be active and support the civil rights movement. Some of them are, of course, not famous people.
Mm-hmm.
Rabbi Heschel is the most famous, perhaps because of his beard and so forth. But Dr. King was very good friends with Rabbi Heschel. They didn't just, he wouldn't have been standing next to Dr. King if he was an unknown person. So we have letters between the two men and so forth.
And this is all on display at the...
Any of this material that we talk about can all be seen. Now, in addition to what we have in the archives, sometimes we put special things up on display.
Okay.
So, for example, right now, we just finished digitizing a very huge and important collection.
Okay.
And this is a collection that we call the Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum collection. And when I say digitize, that means what we did is you or anybody who's listening to us can go on to the website for the American Jewish Archives and see every document, every recording, every movie, everything that's in his collection is now accessible online. I wish I could say everything in the American Jewish Archives was like that, but that takes a lot of money and a lot of effort. We're trying, but you have to do this slowly. Now, why is this collection so important? As you see here, Bill, this is a letter that Rabbi Tannenbaum wrote to Billy Graham.
Okay.
And Rabbi Tannenbaum, who's deceased, Rabbi Tannenbaum is called in history the father of interfaith Jewish-Christian dialogue. He was a young man, was ordained in the 1950s, and he ended up working for an organization called the American Jewish Committee. And he became a specialist in opening up dialogue between Christian groups and Jewish groups. And he died unexpectedly at, I think he was 60 or 61 years of age in the early 1990s. But in his life, he became, if you will, the representative of the American Jewish community to all sorts of leaders from different religions. And his collection came to the American Jewish Archives. So here you have a letter between Rabbi Tannenbaum and Billy Graham, the famous preacher.
Yeah. And
they were friends. He was friends with the Dalai Lama. He was friends with Jerry Falwell. He established important communications which helped religions to communicate with one another. So all the people who are interested in the study of religion in America and how these groups interacted after World War II, this is going to be a very important collection. That's on display. We have a whole display in our gallery on Rabbi Tannenbaum right now, and people can come by whenever they'd like. We're open from 9 to 5 every day during the week, and you don't have an appointment. You can just come in and either look at our gallery, what happens to be up at that time for people to see, or go into the archives and just tell people, hey, I'd like to take a look at these papers or those papers, and they'll be brought right to you.
So in your examples of Billy Graham and Dr.
Rabbi
King,
Tannenbaum, right?
And Rabbi Tannenbaum, in that period, why were these relationships important?
Well, the American Jewish community is a very, very small part of America.
Okay.
We're just a teeny little portion of the American population. And before World War II, many of the Jews in America were either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants.
Okay.
Now, even though it's true that Jews have been in America from the colonial period until the present, most of the Jews trace their ancestry to the Eastern European Jews who started to come in the 1880s, 1890s, and beginning of the 20th century.
But that's in this country.
In this country.
Okay.
And so these Jews lived in their own neighborhoods. They lived in places like the Lower East Side of New York, or on Maxwell Street in Chicago, or in Detroit. They settled as immigrant communities, and very often, not in every case, but very often, many Americans didn't know anything about them. But after World War II, and many of these Jews served in the military and met all sorts of people, a new era opened up. And part of it had to do with the civil rights movement, meaning this idea that the way the world was before World War II and the way what America was fighting for, it's time to make it happen in America. It's one thing to be criticizing people like Hitler and the racists of Europe, but we have our own problems. And so just as there were initiatives to bring dialogue between blacks and Jews during that period, there was also an increasing interest in trying to talk about our religious differences, instead of not just saying, well, your religion is not my religion, and so you have the truth, I don't, or I have the truth and you don't.
Okay.
Why can't we try to find common ground where there are things that we all share. There are things that we don't necessarily agree on, but if you look at the deeper meaning of religion, what it really should be teaching us, it should be teaching us to make the world a better place, to live together in peace. And when you have a religion that's teaching hurt and enmity between people, well, how does that make the world a better place? How does that bring people together? And so there was this big movement that started after World War II to encourage discussions, exchanges of views. There was a big council that met in the Vatican,
Okay.
called the Second Vatican Council, and that was called by the then Pope John the 23rd. And that council discussed, among other things, how the Catholic Church was going to interact with other religions. And there was a special section in that statement from 1965 about Jews and the Catholics.
So I have a question. You talked about immigration and World War II. I know a little bit about how we got to be here in our society. Were the immigrants leaving those areas for religious freedoms or for opportunity, or what was the reason for the immigration?
Well, in speaking about Jews all the time,
Okay.
I always, I tell my students at the Hebrew Union College, they'd smile if they heard me say this, we always say that the Jews came to America because of religious freedom.
Okay.
But that's really not exactly so. The Jews ultimately came to this country always because their lives in Europe was so oppressive. Their opportunities were so restricted to make a living, to live unharassed. They were so impoverished because of the restrictions placed on them as Jews.
What kind of restrictions?
Well, for example, Jews were not allowed to enter into certain professions. Jews were not allowed to own land. Jews were not allowed to live in certain places. In all of American history, Bill, there has never been a governmentally imposed ghetto. Now, there are ghettos, right? We know that certain minority groups live together and we refer to it as a ghetto. But the United States government has never said, you can only live here. But that's how it was in many, many places in Europe. Jews at night had to live within certain restricted areas. There's even was in the 19th century, I know this is hard to believe, but you know how you and I, if we want to go and get married, we go down to City Hall and we buy a license.
Right.
We pay our money. But the rules for Jews for getting married were even more oppressive than just that. You had to be able to show a certain level of financial ability to support your family, and if that wasn't met, you couldn't buy a license to get married. And this oppression, which left Jews with very few exceptions, just incapable of even dreaming about having enough money to eat and to put a roof over their head. They were constantly impoverished. This is what would drive Jews truly to leave Europe and to come to a place like the United States. And that's really the story up until the 20th century.
Okay.
Now, when you get into the situation with Hitler, again, those Jews in Central Europe, the German Jews, they didn't leave Germany because they were coming to America for religious freedom. Hitler was oppressing them, and so they wanted to flee. The problem was, by the 1930s, America had no longer open borders. It no longer welcomed all immigrants. the way it had in the 19th century. You know, we didn't have any immigrant laws at all in this country until the 1880s.
Really?
Oh yeah, you wanted to come, you came, you hopefully registered, though not everybody did, and you were accepted. You know, after so many years, you would apply to become a citizen. And part of that was because America wanted population, and America wanted to bring people and fill up its land. But starting in the 1880s, you have the beginning of immigration restriction. And the first group truly that was restricted were the Chinese.
Okay. And this is information that's available at the museum?
Yes, sure.
With the
and,
archives. Jewish
yes,
archives.
and so the whole story of Jewish immigration and so forth you can find at the American Jewish Archives. And one of the, I don't know if you know how our time is.
Well, I'll tell you what, because I do have a question.
Yes.
But we are coming
Get-
up on a break.
all right.
So we're going to take a break.
Right.
You're watching InFocus with Dr. Zola from the American Jewish Archives, and we'll see you in a moment. Welcome back to InFocus, a closer look at human relations. I'm your host, Bill Bell, and we were, prior to the break, we were talking to Dr. Gary Zola with American Jewish Archives. And we have some interesting conversations during the break. And one of the things is about a Western Union cablegram.
Right.
And I'd like you to share with our
I'd
viewers.
be very, very happy to, Bill. This document here, Bill, is probably the most famous. By that I mean it's been written about in books, and people know that it's at the American Jewish Archives.
Okay.
And sometimes teenagers, when they come to visit us, will say, "What's your most famous document?" And
Okay.
I would have to probably say it's our
And
telegram.
why is this famous?
Well, the reason it's so famous is that it is acknowledged to be the first official notification to the American Jewish community that the Jews in Germany were going to be exterminated. We're literally going to be, in a mechanistic fashion, murdered. And here's how the story goes. When Hitler and the very highest echelon of the Nazis made this decision, the details were assigned to the second level.
Okay.
Those administrators met in January of 1942.
Okay.
And they spent 3 or 4 days together, and they planned out what they were going to do. The order was given. How to fulfill it? They mapped out this whole strategy. They were going to build several big centers. They were going to install gas chambers, asphyxiate people, and then take those deceased people and burn their bodies. And they were going to do this every day until they completed the task. And they had calculated that they could, in some cases, depending on circumstances, they could do several thousand, perhaps even as much as 10,000 people a day. So within the foreseeable...
Just a disregard for people.
That's right. Think of it like potatoes or some kind of commodity. And by the way, Bill, whenever anybody has a chance to go to Berlin, and you go out to this place where this meeting took place, which is still preserved, it's now a museum.
Okay.
And they have kept the minutes of that meeting. The minutes of that meeting were taken carefully. And the originals are on display there in a city called Wannsee.
Okay.
As well as they're translated into many different languages so different peoples can see it. And when you read it, Bill, the question that you just asked is what jumps into your mind immediately. You have to stop and say, are you kidding? You're talking about human beings.
Right.
But the way they discussed it, it was all removed as if it was a potato or candles or some product. And they devised this plan. Now, how does this telegram come into being? Well, there was a man by the name of Gerhard Riegner. Riegner worked for an organization called the World Jewish Congress.
Okay.
Riegner lived in Geneva, Switzerland. And his job was to keep an eye on what was going on with Hitler and the Jews and Germany and so forth, and he would hire informants,
Okay.
spies, to try to bring him information. Apparently in June, several months after this meeting, one of those informants brings him, Regner, this information,
Okay.
which of course he finds difficult to believe. I mean,
Right.
we're talking about exterminating a people.
So you go from an environment where people are prosecuted and
Exactly.
discriminated against. We're just going to just
Murder them.
murder them.
Right. We're going to
Just
just
call it what it is.
Right. And
okay.
and it's like anyone, he finds it hard to accept. How
Right.
could this be? So he spends a little time checking, and he finally feels that this is likely to be true. So he goes to the American Consul, the consulate
Okay.
in Switzerland, and he says, I want to send a telegram to the Jewish leaders in America and in England, and I want to let them know what is possibly going to happen.
Wow.
So it takes, again, and this is a long story, I'm going to make it as short as I can, it takes, again, several weeks, maybe almost a month before the consulate would send this telegram because they don't think it could be true. And they send Regner back to double check. Finally, they send this telegram in August, as you see,
Okay.
August the 29th of 1942. And it's sent to two people at the same time. It's sent to Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the president of the World Jewish Congress. He's in New York.
Okay.
And they send it to a man named Samuel Silverman, who's the head of the World Jewish Congress in Britain. And Silverman happens to also be a member of Parliament.
Okay.
The telegram arrives, and it arrives through the State Department, which is how it was sent.
Yeah.
And we now know, this is all fact, that bureaucrats in the State Department decide not to give the telegram to Rabbi Wise. They decide
Excuse
they're
me.
not sure that it's true. It's so fantastical, they find it difficult to accept. They don't give it to him at all.
Okay.
How does he get it? Because Silverman gets his.
Yeah.
Silverman's a member of the government of Britain, and although the British Foreign Office waits a week too,
Yeah.
they eventually give it to him. And then Silverman sends it to Dr. Wise. And now it all makes sense. If you read it, it's unbelievable. He says, I've received through the British Foreign Office this message from Regner.
Right.
And now the message. And he says there's an alarming report that's under consideration that all Jews in countries occupied or controlled by Germany, 3.5 to 4 million, should be, after deportation and concentration in the East, at one blow exterminated, to resolve once and for all the Jewish question in Europe.
What?
Yes, and then
How do you get that type of information and be cool about it?
well, you see the many people received it and
Right.
thought it was make believe, couldn't accept it.
Because it hadn't
It's
yet
true.
happened.
It hadn't. Well, the fact is, by the time, remember that meeting was in January, by the time this telegram actually gets delivered to Stephen Wise, because of course it has to go from Silverman, and there's all these delays.
Bureaucracy.
Right. There's
Yeah.
almost 1 million people have already lost their lives.
Wow.
Almost 1 million, including about 200,000 children.
Wow.
Little kids. And this is the great tragedy of this whole story. Would you believe, Bill, you know that after 50 years in our government,
Right.
anything that was considered confidential or restricted information by law has to be released.
Okay.
So 50 years after this telegram was sent, a scholar was working at the National Archives, and he
Found it.
found the original that was never given to Rabbi Wise. Now, Rabbi Wise, after he reads it, he goes to the United States government.
Okay.
And he says,
This is what I got.
"This is what I got. What's going on?" And they say, "Well, Rabbi, we're not sure. We don't know. Let us look into it." We're going to try to find out. Of course, we now know they did know, and there's another month and a half that's stalling, and eventually they come to Wise in November, right around this time in 1942, and they say, Dr. Wise, your worst fears are true. And so Wise, the end of November, holds a huge press conference, and on the basis of this telegram and other information that he then had acquired from the government, he announces that Jews are actually being murdered in Europe. And of course, many books have been written about what happens then, and that is that for some reason, the story never becomes gripping to the American public in any way. It makes page 10 of the New York Times, that press conference.
Wow.
Never gets to the front page. And it isn't until 2-3 years later, towards the end of the war, that people really realize what's happened. And that is, as you know, by the end of the war, almost 6 million, a third of all the Jews in the world, literally went up in smoke. And the reason that this is so important, and the reason we teach this, and it's so important to be able to see the real thing.
Yeah.
You know, there are people who say the Holocaust is all made up. It's make-believe. Well, you got to come into the American Jewish Archives and look at documents like this and say, how could this be made up? I mean, do I have thousands and thousands of documents related to this? What, is it all fabricated? It can't be. But the other thing is that...
Well, why would someone make something like that up? And that's, I mean, that's probably another question for another time on another show.
Right.
But it's the thing of it, I guess for me, is the effort that goes into that. There's research typically about those things. All this information is available on a previous show. We had the Scarball Museum that was there.
Right.
Talked about these type of things. So, you know, that's...
Well, here's a way to tie it back to human relations and
Okay.
the Cincinnati Human Relations Council. As tragic as all of this is, to me, the even bigger lesson and why the Holocaust should never be forgotten is not only because of what it did to the Jewish people, which was so calamitous and bestial.
No.
It's because, and you and I have talked about this off camera, it's because that behavior makes human beings into commodities.
Yeah.
And if any government can decide, well, we can just exterminate a people, it's not a far leap, is it, for a government to say, well, maybe we'll drop an atomic bomb on this city, because after all, even though thousands of people will lose their lives and millions of dollars of property will be destroyed, it's for a better cause that I'm in favor of. And when a human being allows, when we forget that every human life is important, that every individual is important, that we're not just potatoes, we're not just candles, we're living beings with family, and everybody deserves that right. That, if we forget that, that's what the Holocaust to me is the bigger lesson, the ongoing lesson. That's why that telegram is to me so very important.
Well, Doctor, we are out of time. I really appreciate you coming by.
Bill,
and I'm
thank
sure
you.
that our viewers also appreciate it. But before we go, I just want you to give contact information for anybody that may have artifacts that they'd like to contribute.
Great.
May want to visit.
Great.
And
Great. So the American Jewish Archives is several buildings located on the campus of Hebrew Union College. That's 3101 Clifton Avenue, catty corner from the University of Cincinnati, right there in Clifton. And we're open every day from 9 o'clock to 5 o'clock, and people can come in off the street to visit, to see our display, and to use the American Jewish Archives.
Fantastic. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Bill.
All
It was a
right.
pleasure.
Nice meeting you.
You too.
All right, you've been watching InFocus, a closer look at human relations, and we will see you next time.